The Fury slipped silently into the heart of the Imperial sector, its massive silhouette cutting through the void. As though it belonged there, the stars around it shining brighter in its wake. The ship was a quiet storm, one that the Empire had never anticipated. The crew of the Fury stood ready, their faces set in a calm determination. Though they knew what was coming, none of them flinched, not even when the first waves of the Imperial fleet began to take shape on their scanners. The Imperials were already in formation, their ships long and sleek, their weapons primed. But the Terrans had not come here to flee or submit. They had come to remind the galaxy that humans were a force that demanded respect. Captain Elena Ward stood tall at the front of the command deck, her eyes scanning the vastness of space ahead, her hands steady. As she reviewed the data flowing in from all sides, she didn't need to say anything. Her crew knew exactly what needed to be done. The Terrans had been building to this moment for years. They had learned from their past mistakes, and now they were ready to face the Empire head-on. Her fingers brushed lightly over the console as a single thought ran through her mind. They will know the Terrans are not to be taken lightly. The comms crackled for the first time. A voice broke through the silence. It was calm, confident, the voice of the Empire, the voice of a commander who believed his victory was already secured. This was the voice of superiority, and it rang out across the cold void of space. Terran Battleship Fury, you are entering restricted Imperial space. Prepare to surrender immediately or face annihilation. The words hung in the air for only a moment before being replaced by static. The commander's expectation of fear was palpable. It was clear he thought they would shrink in the face of overwhelming power. But instead, Elena simply turned to face her crew. A single word passed through her lips. Reply. The communications officer nodded quickly and responded with a voice that matched Elena's calm authority. This is Captain Elena Ward of the Terran Battleship Fury. We do not surrender. There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, just the cold, hard truth of a people who had fought and bled for their place among the stars. The silence that followed was thick. The Imperial commander, no doubt taken aback by the directness of the response. The Empire had not expected this. They had believed Terrans to be a fleeting curiosity, a race to be crushed under the weight of their ships and their arrogance. But they had misjudged. The Terrans had come to stay, and they had come to fight. The crew of the Fury could feel the tension in the air, but they did not flinch. Elena stood firm, her gaze locked on the forward display. She could see the massing Imperial ships drawing closer, but she did not waver. Their response had been sent, and now the Empire had a choice. They could destroy them, or they could retreat. But whatever they decided, the Terrans would not go quietly into the night. As the Fury entered the heart of the Imperial fleet, the crew braced for the inevitable. The quiet hum of the ship was the only sound filling the command deck. For a brief moment, it seemed like the universe held its breath. The Imperial fleet moved in like a predator circling its prey, their ships massive and powerful, each one a testament to the might of the Empire, their sleek forms cutting through space with cold precision, each vessel a weapon designed to dominate the galaxy. The commander of the Imperial fleet stood on the bridge of his flagship, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the data streams that showed the Terran ship locked in their sights. He had seen countless species crumble before him, but the Terran vessel, the Fury, stood out like a blip in an otherwise perfect machine of war. It should have been insignificant, just one ship, but there was something about it that unnerved him, something about its defiance that scratched at the back of his mind. The fleet around him was an unstoppable force. He had no doubt of their power. The Empire had crushed entire civilizations in moments. Nothing in the galaxy could stand against them. But then again, no one had ever fought back quite like this. Before, no one had ever refused to bow down to the Empire with such audacity. No one except the Terrans. The Imperial commander had expected the Terran ship to retreat. When faced with the overwhelming numbers of the fleet, he had expected them to cower and send a desperate plea for mercy. Instead, they had refused his offer of surrender, and now the Terran ship remained on course, its engines burning bright. As though daring the Empire to do its worst, he turned to his tactical officer, a young officer fresh from the Imperial Academy. What are their intentions? The officer looked up from his station, his voice tense. They've not altered course. They're holding steady, as though they mean to face us directly, sir. The commander's lips tightened. He could feel the tension rising throughout the fleet. Their collective confidence was beginning to fray as uncertainty slowly began to creep in. But he would not allow fear to take hold. The Fury might be bold, but it was just one ship facing the might of the Empire. He would crush them without mercy. With a sharp nod, he turned to his weapons officer. "Prepare for engagement. Fire on my mark." As he spoke, the fleet around him shifted into formation. The Imperial ships took up positions, their weapons charging, their energy shields humming with power. The Fury was outmatched in every conceivable way. But that did not stop the commander from wondering what kind of fight they would put up. After all, the Terrans had proven themselves to be unpredictable. He watched through the bridge's viewport as the Fury grew larger on the horizon, its single hull now towering against the backdrop of the Empire's imposing armada. He knew what had to happen next. They would not get a second chance. He would make sure of that. The order was given, and the fleet fired in unison, beams of destructive energy streaking across the stars toward the Fury. But Alina Ward had already anticipated their move with precision only the Terrans were capable of. She gave the order to raise shields. The ship's systems hummed to life, and the Fury braced itself. The energy beams collided with the shields, creating a brilliant flare of light that filled the bridge of the Fury for a split second. But instead of the expected shudder of defeat, the ship held steady, its shields flaring brighter. As they absorbed the energy, every Terran on the command deck felt the ship's defensive systems holding firm. The Fury did not falter. The Empire's opening salvo had struck, but it had not broken them. And that alone was enough to make the Imperial commander pause. He was not ready for this kind of fight, not ready for a race so willing to stare down the void and defy the Empire's wrath. Captain Alina Ward stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the viewport as the light from the Imperial weapons fizzled out against the Fury's shields. The crew around her worked in perfect unison, every movement precise, every glance intentional. They were ready for this. It was what they had trained for, what they had prepared for. But even so, there was a certain weight in the air, a tension that crackled with anticipation. Alina could feel it, but she didn't let it show. Her face remained calm, focused. She knew the stakes, knew what would happen if they failed, but failure was not an option. The communications officer spoke up, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. "Captain, the Imperials are preparing another volley. Their fleet's closing in. They're not letting up." Alina turned slowly to face her, nodding once, then looking to the tactical officer who had already begun rerouting power across the ship. "Shields holding steady," he confirmed. "But they're not backing off. We need to make a move." Alina's mind raced, calculating every possibility in an instant. The Empire wasn't just going to let them go. They would throw everything at the Fury until it was nothing more than debris floating in space. The question wasn't if they would survive the oncoming attack, but how they would respond. She needed a plan, something unexpected, something that would throw the Imperials off balance. Her voice cut through the hum of the control room. "All hands, brace for evasive maneuvers, and make sure our weapons are primed. This ends now." The crew quickly went to work, the ship's engines roaring to life as it veered sharply to the side, narrowly dodging the second volley of energy blasts sent by the Empire. The Fury was agile, faster than the Imperial fleet had anticipated. It wasn't just a hulking warship, it was a predator, sharp and deadly in its movements. As the ship twisted through space, the crew adjusted, firing back with deadly accuracy, the ship's cannons lighting up the darkness of the void. The first blast hit an Imperial fighter, sending it spinning off course, and the second struck another, shattering it into nothing. Alina watched through the viewport as the first wave of Imperial fighters scattered. She knew the Empire had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt. They had believed that Terrans would buckle under pressure, that they would submit to the will of a superior force. But this wasn't how the Terrans fought. They fought with tenacity, with a fierce determination to survive. And that's exactly what the Empire was seeing now. A people who would never back down. "Target their weaker ships," Alina ordered, her voice calm but firm. "Give them no quarter." Her crew worked in harmony, targeting the smaller Imperial vessels that lagged behind the main force. The Fury's weapons fired in rapid succession, tearing through the hulls of the enemy ships with surgical precision. Each shot counted. Each blast was calculated to strike where it would hurt most, taking out weapons arrays and propulsion systems, crippling the Imperial fleet piece by piece. But even as the Fury held its ground, Alina knew this was only the beginning. The Empire had resources, and their fleet was vast. They would not give up so easily. The battle would escalate. Still, Alina was resolute. She was not going to allow the Empire to dominate the skies without a fight. Her people had fought for too long, sacrificed too much, to let this moment slip away. The Imperial commander, still watching from his flagship, was beginning to realize that the Terrans were far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. They were resilient. They were relentless. And for the first time in a long time, the Empire was beginning to feel the weight of their challenge. The tension in the command deck of the Fury was palpable. Alina stood at the center of the room, her hands clasped behind her back, as she observed the battlefield. The Empire's massive fleet continued to regroup after their initial volley, but the Fury was not about to let them regain control. The ship swayed slightly as the engines hummed with power, ready to take on whatever the Empire threw next. "Shields are holding," the tactical officer reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But they're adapting. They're beginning to coordinate their attacks. We'll have to be faster." Alina nodded, her mind already working through the next move. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for the Imperials to make their next move. If they were going to win this battle, they needed to be one step ahead. "Activate evasive protocols," she ordered, her voice firm, "and prepare our main weapon. Let's show them what happens when they underestimate humanity." The crew responded immediately, each member focused on their task. The Fury shifted again, dodging another volley of energy blasts from the Imperial fleet. The ship's agility was becoming more and more apparent as the Imperials realized their initial strategy wasn't going to work. The Fury wasn't just a massive battleship. It was a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of human ingenuity and adaptability. Every maneuver, every shot fired, was calculated to keep the Imperials on the defensive. Then the order came. Alina looked to her weapons officer, her eyes unwavering. "Launch all missiles," she commanded. The Fury's missile bays opened, unleashing a barrage of guided missiles that streaked toward the Imperial fleet. The missiles exploded in rapid succession, targeting the weak points of the Imperial ships. It was a calculated risk, but Alina knew it was their best shot at breaking the Imperial formation. The first wave of missiles struck true, tearing through shields and puncturing the hulls of the smaller Imperial vessels. Direct hit on their outer fleet, the communications officer called out. "They're starting to break apart." Alina's heart raced. This was it. The Empire wasn't prepared for the Fury to hit back like this. She could see the damage from the viewport. Imperial ships were now scattering, trying to avoid the barrage, but it was too late. The missiles had done their job. The smaller ships had been crippled, their ability to fight back severely weakened. But even as the enemy fleet faltered, Alina knew the worst was yet to come. The larger Imperial warships were still out there, their weapons poised to tear the Fury apart. "We've got incoming," the tactical officer warned, his voice laced with urgency. "The enemy flagship is targeting us with their main cannon. They're going all in." Alina didn't flinch. "Brace for impact," she ordered. "Hold the line." The flagship's main cannon fired, a brilliant beam of energy that shot across the dark expanse of space toward the Fury. The ship rocked violently as the energy beam struck the shields, sending a shockwave through the entire vessel. For a moment, the entire crew was thrown off balance, the sound of metal groaning under pressure filling the air. But Alina remained steady, watching the redouts as the ship's systems began to compensate for the damage. "Shields are holding," the tactical officer reported, though his voice was strained. "But we can't take many more hits like that." Alina clenched her fists. We don't need to. Fire back with everything we've got. Let them know we're not backing down." The Fury's weapons came online with a roar, returning fire with devastating precision. The beams of energy from the Fury's cannon struck the Imperial flagship, sending shockwaves through its shields. Alina's eyes never left the viewport, watching as the Imperial ship shook under the force of the attack. The Empire wasn't going to take this fight lightly. But neither were the Terrans. The battle raged on, the Fury weaving through waves of Imperial fire, her cannons roaring in retaliation. Each shot from the Fury was precise, each maneuver a masterclass in human ingenuity. But Alina knew they couldn't keep this up forever. The Empire had a vast fleet, their numbers overwhelming, and the larger warships were starting to regroup, their fire more concentrated. The Fury had dealt a strong blow, but the true test was yet to come. The Imperials were relentless, and now they were adapting. "Captain, they're shifting tactics," the communications officer said, his eyes glued to his screen. "Their flagship is directing their fleet in more coordinated attacks. They're trying to force us into a corner." Alina's brow furrowed. She had expected this. The Empire would regroup, form a more unified strategy, and press harder. They had the resources to do it, but the Terrans had something else: creativity, unpredictability, and the will to fight for their survival. "Redirect power to the engines," Alina commanded, her voice cutting through the noise of the bridge. "We're going to make them chase us." The Fury's engines roared as they surged forward, its massive hull slicing through the dark void like a blade. The ship didn't slow. Instead, it accelerated, darting toward the heart of the Imperial formation, leaving the enemy fleet behind in confusion. The Imperials weren't used to this kind of strategy. Terran ships didn't run. They didn't retreat, but they could maneuver with an agility that the Empire hadn't expected. "Captain, we're closing in on their command ship," the tactical officer said, his voice tight with urgency. "If we hit it now, we might cause enough damage to disrupt their coordination." Alina nodded. The flagship was the key to breaking the Empire's unity. If they could take it down, or at least disable it, the Imperial fleet would be thrown into disarray. They didn't need to win this fight. They just needed to create chaos. The Fury moved faster, faster than the Imperials thought possible. Its weapon systems hummed, preparing to fire. As the ship closed in, Alina's mind raced. She had only one chance. The flagship would have heavy defenses, more than they could handle in a head-to-head fight. But there was a weakness, a gap in their shields where the energy beam from their cannon had struck earlier. It was the perfect spot to strike, a small opening that could turn the tide in their favor. "Prepare for a high-velocity strike," Alina ordered. "Target their shield generator. We hit that, and the flagship's defenses will collapse." The crew sprang into action, recalibrating the weapon systems. The Fury's forward cannons powered up, their targeting systems locking onto the weak spot in the flagship's shields. Time seemed to slow as the ship drew closer, the massive Imperial vessel looming larger in the viewport. "Target locked," the weapons officer called out. "Ready to fire on your command." Alina took a deep breath. The weight of the moment hung heavily on her shoulders, but she didn't hesitate. Fire. The Fury's cannons erupted in a blinding flash of light, a concentrated burst of energy hurtling toward the flagship's shield generator. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then the explosion rocked the Imperial ship, sending shockwaves through its structure. The flagship's shields faltered, its defensive systems sputtering under the force of the strike. "Direct hit," the tactical officer shouted. "The shield generator is down. They're vulnerable." Alina didn't wait for confirmation. "All units, engage. Target the flagship's propulsion systems and weapons arrays. Now." The Fury's weapons fired again, striking the Imperial flagship with precision. The ship's engines erupted in flames, its once imposing form now racked with explosions and chaos. The fleet was thrown into confusion, the organized attacks falling apart as the flagship's leadership faltered. The Imperials had underestimated one thing: human unpredictability. And now, the tide of the battle was beginning to turn. The Fury's weapons blazed as the Imperial flagship crumbled, but Alina knew this wasn't the end. The flagship's destruction had thrown the enemy fleet into disarray, but there was still danger. The remaining Imperial warships were regrouping, their firepower concentrated in a way that made even the Fury's agile movements feel like they might not be enough. Alina had calculated the risks of this battle, but she also knew the Empire wasn't going to back down easily. They had more than just firepower. They had resources, and they had pride. "Captain," the communications officer said, breaking through her thoughts, "we've detected something unusual. There's a power surge in the lower decks. Internal systems are coming online. It's coming from the weapons bay." Alina turned sharply toward the officer. Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "We don't know, Captain, but it's generating massive amounts of energy. It's not like anything we've seen before." Alina's mind raced. The Fury had a number of experimental weapons, prototypes that had been designed to give them an edge if things went south. She'd been keeping one particular weapon hidden for just such a situation. The Terran fleet wasn't large, but they made up for it with ingenuity, with a willingness to take risks, and sometimes that meant pushing the limits of what was possible. "Activate the weapon," Alina ordered, her voice cold and firm. Now. The crew worked quickly, rushing to implement the emergency protocol. The lower decks hummed to life, and a low rumble filled the ship as the hidden weapon began to power up. Alina watched, her eyes focused, never leaving the tactical display in front of her. The Imperial fleet was regrouping, their remaining ships closing in on the Fury. If they didn't disrupt their attack now, it would be over. The weapon had to work. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the weapon charged. Every second felt like a lifetime, and Alina couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Not when they were so close. She knew the weapon had never been tested in battle before, only in simulations, but the crew had done everything to prepare. The power levels continued to rise. It was nearly ready. "Weapon is at full charge," the tactical officer said, his voice tense. "Captain, we've never used it in real combat before." "We don't have time for hesitation," Alina snapped, her eyes fixed on the fleet. "We use it now, or we lose everything." With a final, sharp intake of breath, Alina gave the order. "Fire the weapon." A blinding beam of energy shot from the Fury's core, cutting through the emptiness of space. It was like nothing the Empire had ever seen. The beam didn't just destroy ships, it twisted the very fabric of space around it, distorting gravity and pulling enemy ships into a maelstrom of energy. The first Imperial ship caught in its path shuddered and disappeared in a blink, its systems overwhelmed by the intense gravitational forces. The shockwaves rippled outward, creating a chain reaction as more ships were caught in the weapons field. The Empire had no idea how to react. Direct hit on multiple Imperial ships, the tactical officer said, awe in his voice. "They're being torn apart. It's like they can't even fight back." Alina allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction, though she knew this was only temporary. The weapon had worked, but it was unpredictable. She couldn't rely on it forever. The Imperial fleet was still massive, and they wouldn't give up easily. But the balance had shifted. Now, it was the Terrans who had the advantage. "We keep pushing," Alina said, her voice steady as ever. "They're not going to get a chance to recover." As the Fury surged forward, the Empire's once dominant fleet was now in chaos. Their carefully calculated attacks had turned into panic, and for the first time, they were the ones who were vulnerable. Alina looked to her crew, each of them focused and determined. They had done it. They had struck back with a power that was almost too much to comprehend. The battle was far from over, but the Fury had given them a fighting chance. The battle was far from over, and Alina knew it. The Imperial fleet was reeling, some ships still caught in the maelstrom of the Fury's weapon, but not all of them. The Empire was powerful, and they weren't going to let this defeat stand without retaliation. Alina's heart raced as she watched the Imperial warships pull back and regroup. They were calculating their next move, and she could see the signs. They were preparing for a counterattack, one that would be even more devastating than the first. "Captain, they're realigning their formation," the tactical officer said, his voice urgent. "They're coming at us with everything they have. I've never seen them do this before." Alina's eyes flicked to the display, noting the way the Imperial fleet was moving. It wasn't just a shift in strategy. It was a show of overwhelming force. The remaining Imperial warships were converging, forming a perfect circle around the Fury, their weapons primed, their shields raised. The Fury was outnumbered, and the weapon they had used earlier was still charging. They didn't have much time before it was ready again, and the odds were stacking against them. "Captain, their main fleet is closing in fast," the communications officer said. "They're locking all weapon systems on us. If we don't get out of this formation, we'll be overwhelmed." Alina's jaw clenched. She knew the risk. Staying in a defensive position wasn't an option. But breaking through the enemy's tight formation was going to be a hell of a challenge. She had to act quickly, before the Empire could get the upper hand. "Engage evasive maneuvers," Alina ordered, her voice sharp and decisive. "All power to the engines, divert energy from shields. We need to outmaneuver them." The Fury surged forward, her engines roaring to life as the crew pushed the ship to its limits. Alina could feel the ship shudder as the sudden thrust strained the structure. The Imperial fleet opened fire, energy beams flashing toward the Fury, but they missed. By mere inches, the ship twisted and turned, darting through the enemy's crossfire with a speed that defied its massive size. Every movement was calculated, every shift in direction designed to force the enemy to adjust their aim. But the Imperials weren't going down without a fight. "Captain, they've launched another wave of fighters," the tactical officer warned. "It's a full assault. They're trying to box us in." Alina's heart raced as the small Imperial fighters swarmed the Fury, firing relentlessly from all sides. The Fury's cannons returned fire, taking down several of the smaller ships with precision shots. But there were too many. The Terran ship was a predator, but it was not invincible. Alina's mind raced as the fighters closed in. "All hands, brace for impact," she ordered, her eyes scanning the incoming swarm. "Get those fighters off us. We need to focus on the bigger ships." The Fury's point defense systems came to life, blasting smaller ships out of the sky in quick succession. But even with the fighter assault faltering, the larger Imperial warships closed in. Their energy beams were relentless, each one striking the Fury's shields and causing the ship to tremble under the force. Alina's eyes narrowed. They couldn't keep this up much longer. The Fury's shield generators were weakening, and the experimental weapon had drained a significant amount of power. They needed an edge, something to turn the tide again. "Prepare the secondary weapon," Alina commanded, her voice steady even as the battle raged around her. "We've got one shot at this." The crew worked quickly, rerouting energy from auxiliary systems to the secondary weapon. It wasn't as powerful as the first one, but it was a close-range, high-intensity energy burst that could disrupt the Imperial fleet's systems. Alina took a deep breath. This was their last chance. The Imperial fleet closed in, their weapons charging for one final strike. Alina's hands gripped the console as she watched the readouts. The Fury was taking hits, but the secondary weapon was almost ready. The seconds felt like hours as the enemy fleet tightened the noose. "Now," Alina shouted. "Fire!" The secondary weapon unleashed a burst of energy, a searing beam that ripped through the Imperial fleet's formation. The beam tore into the heart of one of the largest warships, disabling its weapons and sending it spiraling into the void. The energy burst then radiated outward, disrupting the systems of several other Imperial ships. For a moment, everything was silent. The Empire's fleet staggered, their coordinated attack unraveling. Alina's breath caught in her chest. The tables had turned once again. The silence after the energy burst was deafening. For a moment, it seemed as if the whole galaxy had paused to witness the shift in power. The Imperial fleet, once so confident and unyielding, now seemed unsure. Their largest warships had been damaged, their formations broken, and their once tight coordination was starting to unravel. The Fury had dealt a devastating blow. But Alina knew better than to believe the fight was over. The Empire wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. "Captain, their flagship is still operational," the tactical officer said, his voice urgent. "It's charging up again. They're going for a direct assault." Alina's eyes snapped to the display. The Imperial flagship was maneuvering through the wreckage of its fleet, making its way toward the Fury with terrifying speed. The remaining Imperial ships, although scattered, were converging on the Fury once more. This wasn't just a last stand. It was a full-out desperation move. They knew they couldn't afford to lose, and they were throwing everything they had left at the Terran ship. "We won't make it through another direct hit like that," the weapons officer warned. "Our shields are nearly gone. The weapon systems are almost drained." Alina's mind raced. They had just one option left, a final, reckless gamble. If they could take down the flagship, they could break the Empire's will to fight. But it would take everything the Fury had left, and if it failed, they wouldn't survive. "All hands, prepare for a one-way strike," Alina ordered. Her voice was calm, but the weight of the decision was heavy. This is it. The crew sprang into action, setting the ship on a direct course for the Imperial flagship. Every sensor, every weapon system, was aligned to strike. The Fury's engines roared, pushing the ship faster than it had ever gone before. The remaining Imperial warships, still recovering from the previous attack, attempted to reposition themselves, but the Fury was already charging toward their flagship at full speed. "Brace for impact," Alina said, her grip tightening on the control panel. The ship's weapons were primed, and her crew was in position. It was now or never. The Imperial flagship locked onto the Fury, its main cannon charging up for one final devastating shot. Alina knew that the Fury's shields couldn't take another blast, but they weren't relying on shields this time. The plan was to get in close and use the ship's last remaining energy to disable the flagship with everything they had. It was a suicide run, but it was their only chance. "Fire the forward weapons, full power," Alina commanded. The Fury's cannons erupted, sending a barrage of energy blasts at the flagship as they closed the distance. One shot after another struck the Imperial ship, but the flagship's shields held strong. "Not enough," the weapons officer said, his voice strained. "Shields holding." Alina's eyes narrowed. They needed to get closer. The Fury was just meters from the flagship now. She could see the lights flickering on the enemy ship, the desperation in its movements. But then, something unexpected happened. The Imperial commander, perhaps seeing the inevitable, gave the order to fire. The flagship's cannon fired. A blast of energy tore through space toward the Fury. Alina had mere moments to react. In that instant, she made the only choice she could. She cut the engines, forcing the Fury to drop out of its trajectory just enough to avoid the blast. The energy beam grazed the ship's side, sending a shockwave through the hull, but the Fury didn't falter. Alina threw everything she had into the final push. "All weapons, now," she shouted. The remaining energy surged through the Fury's cannons as they fired point-blank at the Imperial flagship's vulnerable systems. The beams slammed into the flagship's core, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The Imperial flagship trembled, and then, with an ear-shattering explosion, it broke apart. The ship was gone. The Fury shuddered violently, but Alina didn't take her eyes off the viewport. The rest of the Imperial fleet hesitated, their formation broken, their flagship destroyed. One by one, the remaining Imperial ships began to retreat, the survivors unsure and unwilling to face another devastating attack. Alina allowed herself a moment of relief as the battle ended. The Fury had survived, but so much had been lost. The crew, battered but alive, stood in the stillness that followed the chaos of war. Elena turned to her crew, her voice firm. "We've won this day. But we don't stop here. We fight until every Terran is free." The crew cheered, but Elena's gaze was far off, looking beyond the wreckage of the battle. There was much more to do, and the war was far from over.